Good evening again, everyone. I'm terribly sorry about all the technical difficulties. My name is Nicholas Thompson. I am a social justice activist and president of the Union of Taxation Employees, Toronto North. I'm your host for this evening's panel discussion on anti-Black racism. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I can't breathe are the three words that rock the world with massive protests ensuing in the midst of a global pandemic with calls to end anti-Black racism. George Floyd was his name, and 8 minutes and 46 seconds was how long a police officer kneed his neck until he died. Across the border in Canada, anti-Black racism is not new. Black people have been in Canada since the beginning of the 16th century. We did not have the right to vote, and when we finally fought for that right, a barrier was put in place to prevent us from exercising that right. We then had to own property in order to be eligible to vote. Now, whilst we've made some progress over the last 4 centuries, the system that was designed to oppress Black people continues unabated. The system is not broken. It is functioning exactly the way it was designed to, and that is to oppress one group while providing privileged access to another. Canadian cities have started acting, and I'm very hopeful. Anti-Black racism was declared an emergency in Brampton, Mississauga, and Caledon. In Ottawa, racism was declared a public health issue. And in Montreal, the city's own consultation office detailed racism and discrimination across municipal institutions, outlining 38 recommendations that call for sweeping changes, greater transparency, specific targets, and accountability at the executive level for everything from hiring for city positions to policing to cultural programs to housing. And that's only in Montreal. At the federal level, the Right Honorable Prime Minister Justin Trudeau acknowledged that systemic racism is an issue right across the country in all our institutions, including in all our police forces, including the RCMP. And last year, the former Treasury Board President Jane Philpott said that the government is aware that bias in the federal public service is preventing Black workers from being promoted to the highest levels. And she went on to further acknowledge that there are systemic barriers for Black employees in terms of getting jobs, advancing in their careers, and being underrepresented. Now, the Canada Revenue Agency is one of those federal agencies that Ms. Philpott was referring to. Now let's take a look at the numbers, starting with the most senior positions. So the CRA is governed by a board of management of 14 executives. None are Black. The commissioners are followed. Out of the 2 senior officers, none are Black. The 5 regions of the country are managed by assistant commissioners, out of the 5, none are Black. Managing the agency's 40,000 employees are local directors. Across the country, there are 68 directors, out of which there is one Black director. So why isn't the Canada Revenue Agency not appointing Black people to senior positions? For a start, the agency has not acknowledged that anti-Black racism exists. Today, we will hear the voices of Black employees and we will hear from experts on the issue. How do we move forward? Joining me today are panelists Janelle Brady. Janelle is an activist, research, a community organizer, and an anti-racist educator. She serves on several boards, including Progress Toronto, Regenesis, and she's currently a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Toronto in the Department of Social Justice Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. And in that institute, she's currently the senior coordinator of the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies. And she has been around in terms of covering anti-Black racism. She's been featured by City News, CBC, Global TV, the Toronto Star, the Huffington Post, and other local media outlets. So please join me in welcoming Janelle Brady. Hi, Janelle. How are you tonight? Awesome. All right. So our next panelist is Courtney Betty. He is an attorney at law licensed to practice in Canada and in the Caribbean. He began his legal career at the Department of Justice, Canada, representing the federal government in complex legal matters. This included representing the Canada Revenue Agency in matters such as scientific tax research credits. We know that term at the CRA, it's very familiar. He is a strong believer in Canada's multiculturalism, and he has been part of the development of diversity strategies for the RCMP, Pan Am Games, the City of Toronto, and other organizations. His understanding of the challenges that's facing the Black community, both in systemic racism and the justice system, is very unique, as he having represented families of victims of gun violence, as well as police officers facing racial discrimination. Please join us.
Hey, hi, Nicholas. You just got to make a change there, because I think on the YouTube link, the audience just needs to be able to log in, so you may have to send out a new link, but great to be here.
All right, so our next panelist is our final panelist. One of our panelists unfortunately had another commitment at 7:30 and is unable to join us. That is Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress, Brother Larry Russo, and he sends his regrets. Our final panelist is Dr. Vidoll Regisford. He serves as principal of a private consulting and clinical counseling practice, and his work actually straddles both the public nonprofit and private sector. He's a licensed psychotherapist, and he holds postgraduate degrees, specifically social service work, a master's in education, along with a doctorate in counseling and postdoctorate degree, and counseling psychology. He's also the former director of diversity and inclusion at Purelator. And his clients include first responders throughout Canada, that is the police, ambulance, fire services, national aviation and navigation agencies, and also provincial ministries, municipal and local governments. Please welcome Dr. Regisford.
Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here. It's good to see you again, Courtney. It's been some time.
It has been quite some time, so great to see you.
Likewise.
Thank you very much. So we're going to begin today's panel with just hearing from our members. And I'm going to begin with hearing from Jennifer. Jennifer, are you there? All right, awesome. Jennifer.
Nicholas, you just on a technical, you may have to send out a new link for the YouTube, because I think the old link is the one that's still active right now.
Okay,
so, yeah.
Just give me one moment.
So while we're waiting for that, it doesn't mean that we have to remain silent. We might as well make use of the airtime. Can anyone hear me?
I can definitely hear you, yes.
Okay. Janelle, can you hear me?
Janelle, yeah.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We're also live.
That's okay.
On YouTube, so yeah, just so you know. We're live.
And how's it going at Boise?
All right.
I think we're back now.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the problem there. We've updated the link. Okay, so I'm going to bring on Jennifer now. Jennifer has been with the agency for 30 years, so she's a veteran employee, and she will be retiring soon. So we'd love to hear from her. Jennifer, I'm going to bring you on.
Good evening, Nicholas, Janelle. Hey, Courtney. We're there.
Yes, go ahead. Tell us about your experience working at the agency as a Black woman. Tell us what you
what I've accomplished, what I see, what I recognize. If you had started this conversation about 2 weeks ago, I probably would not have been able to come on camera because it was emotional for me. Just the whole concept about talking about Black lives in 30 years with the agency. I've seen a lot. When I first started at Toronto East, it consisted mainly of, and I'm going to say it in this order, white employees, Asian Chinese, I think I say that right, and Blacks. The other visible minorities didn't really make up. The numbers were low. And I recall shortly after I started, a number of Black employees were invited to attend a meeting downtown, and we were asked questions about hiring of Blacks in the organization. Shortly after that, they started doing a little bit more hiring, and I think employment equity came in as a result. I've seen a lot of our colleagues be overlooked for promotions. I've seen they change the staffing guidelines so that it just seems to favor a particular group of employees. I've seen a lot of our Black colleagues remain stagnant at one particular level all the time. Right now, I believe we have a couple of MG3s and 2 or 3 MG5 alone just in our office. Those numbers are low. And there is nobody at the AD level that are representative of the Black community. Usually whenever you enter selection process, you're thinking, oh, this is great, I know a lot. In the end, you don't get the job, you get overlooked. So our numbers are diminishing in the office when it comes to Black employees. They're not backfilled. I would say probably in the last year, I can count a handful of new recruits. Mm-hmm. I usually get excited about that because especially the younger they are, the better, because they have a way to go. It could be better. I know as the employees retire, there is no succession planning to bring on more Black employees. So you find one or two particular diverse group exists, but not the Black community. And that's disappointing. It's disappointing because we're all lumped under the one umbrella of visible minorities. But when they're pulled, we're not being pulled. The Blacks are not being pulled.
Jennifer, let me ask you this. You've been around for a long time. 30 years is a very long time.
Retiring.
What has career progression looked like for you?
It hasn't. It's limited career progression. I'm not where I'm capable of being, but that's how they do the system. That's the way the system works. That's what they say the system works. They don't develop any of the employees. They pick and choose who they give acting opportunities to and who they develop. So they can justify picking a non-Black colleague to say, well, the person has did this, the person has exhibit this, and as a result, that's who I'm going to develop. They don't recruit, they don't mentor. They mentor, but they look for specific people on who to mentor. So your opportunities are lost. After a while, the employees get frustrated because if they're constantly being denied opportunities, they're going to give up. And I find that that's what has happened. And it takes a while for them to get rejuvenated again to start another process. So that's what's happened to me over the years. And I know that's happened to a lot of the employees over the years.
Okay.
So
thank you.
Roadblocks.
Much.
So
one last question. What would your message be to the agency? What can they change that would make it more accessible for Black people?
One, I think they need to go out and recruit from the high schools, from the colleges, from the universities, and in the areas where they know, the locations where they know they will have the community is. So you've got George Brown, you've got Humber, you've got Ryerson. There's a lot of, instead of just UFT. I don't know if they go to York, but they have to go to the market where the individuals are. Start in the high school so that they can get, and when they do, you got to send somebody out that looks like the group you're trying to recruit. If you send somebody that doesn't look like them, the likelihood is they will not get engaged into choosing that career. I would also say to have a constant conversation with the local management about an honest conversation about reaching outside and mentoring the existing employees that are there. That's what I can encourage people to do. Talk to their ADs, their managers, their director, and try and get, what do I need to achieve where I need to be? And let them know you're just as talented and educated as anybody else deserving of the position.
Thank you.
So,
thank you very much.
I hope that helps. Good luck, Nicholas, and I look forward to working with you on this endeavor. Black Lives Matters.
Thank you. And that was Jennifer Phillips, an employee at the Toronto East Tax Services Office, and she shared her experience after being with the agency for 30 years, that career progression is not a thing, was not her experience. Thank you very much for sharing, Jennifer. I'm going to bring on the next member, and she's going to tell us what her experience has been at the agency. I'm going to bring on Tanya, and Tanya has been with the agency since 2006. Hi, Tanya. Welcome. If you can just click the unmute button. There we go. That's okay. Welcome. Welcome. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you, Nicholas?
Awesome. Thank you. So tell us, what you've been with the agency for a number of years. What is that, 14 years?
Yes.
Tell us what your experience has been as a Black woman in the agency.
Okay. So I just want to say good evening to everyone first off. For me, my experience, I would say it was very difficult. I started in the call site. We had our struggles in the call site. But for me, things really kind of went downwards a little bit when I went to collections.
Mm-hmm.
My first few years in collections, I had a horrible time with the team leader that was supporting me at the time. She actually wasn't very supportive. I felt targeted on my team. I dealt with a lot of harassment, a lot of belittling. She really affected my confidence. For me, I'm speaking right now and I'm actually kind of emotional because when you asked me to speak on this topic, or when I volunteered to speak on this topic, it brought up a lot of old feelings that I had kind of suppressed. One thing that is hard for Black people working in office environments or in any environment, when you feel targeted or you feel oppressed or you're dealing with difficulties at work with a team leader who doesn't support you, when you don't have the support of management to go to, because I went to management several times. At the time, I also went to the union. I didn't have any support. So I had to hold all of that in, which started to affect my health. It started to affect my performance. Everything snowballed for me.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very, very traumatic. And for me, I just wanted to speak up. I just wanted to say Black Lives Matter. I wanted to speak up just for all of the members that never do, that go through these experiences and don't say anything to anyone, maybe speak amongst their peers, which is what I did a lot until I couldn't take it anymore. And then I tried to get help. And it was very difficult. But what I will say on the flip side to that is that I've had the chance to heal. I've also had the chance to work with wonderful team leaders after that who were encouraging, helped me to figure out what I wanted to do within the agency. So that was a blessing. But still, there's lots of work that has to be done in the agency for us, especially Black people.
Do you believe that you could attain senior level in the agency as it stands right now?
Honestly, no. No, I don't. I think, as Jennifer had mentioned, we're overlooked. And normally, they already know who they want in certain positions. They already know who they want to groom or who they want to work on. So I feel that I'm overlooked, or I have been overlooked. And it's affected my confidence for sure. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That was Tanya. Tanya has been with the agency for a number of years, and she shared her experience of how she faced harassment in the workplace and discrimination and being overlooked as a Black woman. And just before we move to the next segment, I'm going to share about my experience as the first Black president of the local. And we have, I've been in office since 2018. And my journey actually started in the union when I faced discrimination in the workplace. And that's what brought me to the union. And when I looked at the union, I didn't see many people that looked like me. So I was determined to make a change, not only within the workplace, but within the union. And when I became the president of the union, I recognized quickly that things my predecessors practices or that they were able to do and decisions that they were able to easily make, right? I wasn't able to make those decisions. I had to be 10 times as democratic as they were, right? And every single decision that that were to be made had to be at a, it had to be it always had to involve everyone when my predecessors would make certain decisions on certain things and then involve everyone in other decisions. And when I came on board, I was told, Nicholas, these are the steps you follow. This is how you make decisions, and this is how you run the organization. And I followed those steps. But I didn't have that same privilege as my predecessors to be able to govern the same way that they did. So I had to ensure that I was above scrutiny, that every single decision had to go through all of these checks to ensure that, when I come out on the other side, that I'm not affected. We have, as a local, we've led in technology, we've led in innovation, we have led in many areas, but I will never get credit for that because of the color of my skin, because giving me credit for that would make me look good. And we do not want Nicholas to look good as a leader, as a Black man. And those are some of the challenges that I face. It is, it's hurtful. So not only are you fighting for changes and advancement within the workplace, but you're also facing those challenges in the union. And I've been a strong voice for this movement, and for actually, I've raised these issues years ago, and the union, my colleagues in the union said, now is not the time to talk about this. It's not the place to talk about this. And I was shut down. And up to recently, when I was organizing this town hall and to push for these conversations and within the workplace and the union, one of my colleagues, my union colleagues, called for me to be disciplined for being a bigot and discriminating against other members because of wording on the invitation for this town hall. So in other words, when you speak up as a Black man, they try to silence you using the system. And I call that pulling a Karen, using white privilege, using your authority, your privilege, and using the organization's constitution to attempt to silence me for speaking up, for doing nothing wrong, mind you. And it is unfortunate, but it is experiences like those that helps us to fight even harder to change the system and to ensure that it is just and equitable for everyone. So I'm going to just go over to our panelists here. I'm going to bring on Janelle Brady, and she's going to tell us a little bit about privilege and how to identify it, and how to be a good ally in this fight. So I'm going to bring you on now, Janelle.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nicholas. And thank you to the members who shared their experiences. They're trying, they're tiring, and it's about time for change. We shouldn't have to hear these stories in 2020. So I'll speak about white privilege. First, I wanted to just define what privilege is, what that means, because that word is floating around quite a bit. And we cannot assume that everyone understands what it means. So it's basically those unearned benefits that belongs to particular people. And this affords certain people a position of power. So you could think of it as someone being born with a head start before they've even had to try for it, right? So as Nicholas said, and as others have said, having to work hard, having to work twice as hard, having to try very hard, but not really having those unearned benefits. Those are earned. More specifically, white privilege is tied to whiteness. So it's tied to race. It's tied to the skin. And it's basically that folks occupy a position of power, if you would, within society because of the color of their skin. So For instance, some people would say, well, I'm not privileged. You know, I had to work hard. I grew up in housing. I'm a white person. What is that? Someone could be poor and white, and that's for sure. But as you've heard, many of you may have heard, you're not poor because you are white. So it's a different thing. Folks who are poor and Black are poor because they are Black. So white privilege is thinking about race and racism and how racism is embedded systemically within all of our institutions, housing, employment, education. And what folks mentioned earlier in terms of their experiences is how that unearned privilege operates within the workplace. So not being mentored, not being groomed into positions is one very prevalent example of privilege, white privilege in particular in the workplace, where certain folks don't fit into a certain culture. They don't speak the same way. They don't have the same stories to share about their kids in hockey on the weekend. They don't want to go out for drinks with you. They don't want to be part of those social activities. Maybe they don't drink, maybe not in that way. Maybe they like to dance, right? Mm-hmm. So they're not really being brought to the table beyond the workplace, like those really important conversations in the halls. And by virtue, they're being left out. And privilege kind of operates in a way where you're not really one of us. And that is so important in terms of who gets hired, who gets brought up, who gets promoted, who gets groomed into the positions, right? Rather than turning around and saying, oh, you don't have the right skill sets. So that's how I would explain it.
Sorry, I lost you there. Are you still there, Janelle? I lost you there. I didn't hear the last your last
All
sentence.
right.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm still here. So yeah, just really those pieces around privilege. I was talking about, I don't know where I left off. But basically, the way to think about it is unearned benefits. And in this case, it's tied to whiteness and white skin.
Thank you. So tell me, how can white people and other racially visible groups be an ally to the Black community? What does that look like?
Okay, so first, it would be recognition of that privilege, right? That's the very, very first step. It's to at least acknowledge that positions that you occupy within society are due to systems of racism that are embedded within our institutions. And people have shared their experiences, and those are horrible experiences. And I hope that those listening who are not Black are outraged, more outraged than me, right? Because our friends, our community members, our colleagues should never have to go through that. So for non-Black racialized communities, I'll start with, they need to be critical of how they also benefit from a system of anti-Black racism. So if our country was built on anti-Indigenous racism, genocide, and displacement of Indigenous peoples, and the labor of Black people, enslaved people brought to the land to ensure there's a profit not too far in our history, then how do other groups also benefit from those systems? And how can they be critical allies, not just allies on the sidelines, but critical allies, part and parcel, really, to this fight against anti-Black racism? Often what happens is Black folks and non-Black racialized folks might be kind of separate and apart in workplaces and schools. And some people may even say, I don't want you to have any Black friends. I don't want you to bring any Black friends home. You dare not marry a Black person, right? And they say these things to their kids, but then they'll say, well, I'm okay, with Black people. So a lot of people in the South Asian community, in the East Asian community are having these really critical conversations. So it just means showing up. So reassessing within your families, within your communities, how anti-Blackness prevails. So comments, looking at the comments that you make to your kids, your family members, saying, don't go outside, you're gonna get dark, saying things like that. What does that then teach your kids? What does that then say within your own communities? The other piece is prejudice and stereotypes, right? So not reinforcing these stereotypes within your own families, within your own communities, and prejudice, these preconceived notions as well.
Right.
But the key piece too is it becomes racism when you have the power to act on it. And before that, it's simply, not simply, because it's still harmful, prejudice or stereotypical behavior. So saying, I will not hire a Black person in my unit, in my department, because I think they are lazy or that sort of thing. Or I rather hire someone I know. So then that means you only really have people you know who maybe look like you within your unit, within your team, right? So non-Black racialized folks need to really think about how they also benefit from this system of anti-Black racism, more than just empty words, into action. And for instance, the example for schools is if a Black teacher puts on if there's a Black History Month event, it's often the Black teacher who is leading the conversation. But non-Black racialized people need to also support and think way back in last February about how we're going to put on this event and how we're going to do it throughout the year. Similarly for this conversation, I'm sorry to say this now, but I see, Nicholas, I see folks adding their stories, but I want to feel like there's more support from members of the community. I'm an outsider, I don't know everything, but from the other panels that I've done, I can tell you it takes a community of 5-10 people in the background running the tech. The moderator isn't doing the tech. So where are the allies? That's what I would like to know. If you're putting on a conversation about anti-Black racism, where are the allies to support you in putting this on? So it's not falling on you because you endure it and then you're having the conversation about it too, right? So those are my preliminary comments about that.
Thank you. I'm going to switch to one of the comments that were provided by one of the members, and it is, how does anti-Black racism differ from racism against other people of color?
So anti-Black racism. So first I'll define anti-Black racism because that's a word that's really floating around quite a bit. It's different than racism because, I'll go back to racism. Racism is different than prejudice or discrimination because racism, you just have to tie it into power. Do you have the power to act on this? Or systemic racism, is it embedded in our institutions? Are Black children failing at a higher rate? Are they being pushed out of the education system? Are they being called names and not having educators take full accountability for their actions? That's systemic racism. But anti-Black racism is a particular type of racism that speaks to Blackness. And it's not new. And basically, it's against Black people. It's a type of racism that's against Black people at the individual level or the institutional level. And it undervalues Black lives, Black culture, Black knowledge, where basically whiteness is placed at the top. So if you were to think of it as a hierarchy, you'd have Black at the bottom, white at the top. And then you'd have different groups on a hierarchy getting to that top position, which is sometimes referred to as proximity to whiteness. And some people fight very hard to get that proximity to whiteness, whereas some would say, let's just tear it down and crash it and not have this system. And I'm not advocating for a colorblind approach because saying I don't see race means you don't see me, right?
Hmm.
So rather being very critical about how this system has come to be, where we have this hierarchy of racism.
I will ask one more question from our audience, and it is: does anti-Black racism also include someone who is born in Africa to an Indian or Muslim parents?
So can they be can they have anti-Black racism enacted towards them?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Because someone who was born in Africa, as soon as you come to North America, you're considered Black. So that would definitely be someone who is considered Black. And it's funny too, right? The conversations about Islamophobia tend to be separate from Blackness. But I was listening to a panel the other day, can't remember which one because there's so many.
Right.
But there are Black Muslims and tons of Black Muslim people as well. So why is there this imagined idea of Muslims not being Black, right? So definitely that would be an example of anti-Black racism.
Okay, so I'm going to thank you very much, Janelle. I'm going to bring on Courtney Betty now, attorney at law, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his experience, and we're going to ask him some questions about how we can fix this moving forward, fix this problem within the public service moving forward.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for putting this together. And I know that we've had some some technical difficulties, but you know, whenever you're trying to do something that's great, you know, there may be things or hiccups that happen. But it's an incredible moment in time that we're living in right now. I think what we're seeing is a passing of the mantle at this time in history to individuals such as yourself. And I think it's a great time. I mean, you know, from fighting for freedom, from fighting to have access to education, from fighting to vote, from bringing opportunities in the workplace through many different types of legislation. There's a feeling universally when you're seeing marches happening in, you know, all over the world. Australia, for example, where the indigenous people there are marching to say Black Lives Matter. There's something very unique that is happening, and the opportunity is for us now to really grasp it. And I think a major part of it is how do we do it in a unified fashion. You know, the starting point for me has always been the law and looking at, you know, the legislation that we have. I at one time considered myself a constitutional law expert because I just love the charter. I love the idea that, you know, we have protection written into our constitution. Unfortunately, I think, you know, over the last 20 years, we've not seen the kind of movement that we should have had. And that sort of pent-up combustion is what we're seeing manifesting right now in the United States and here as well in Canada. It really has been, you know, nothing has happened for so long. What do we do now? And in looking at the Canadian environment that we're in, there is this strong goal for us to become unified together. You know, the panelists, for example, it was great to reconnect again because we're all doing the same things in many different ways. And it's how do we unify our efforts in, for example, strategies for diversity enhancement, right? Strategies within the organization. Can we develop a common agenda?
Right.
Can we have a situation where we have multiple groups working together? Can we work across different divisions within the Canada Revenue Agency? Can we figure out a way that we can measure what we're trying to accomplish? A lot of the data that you laid out first in terms of the lack of opportunities that are there. Can we establish mechanism where there's shared accountability, right? And with all of this, there has to be dedicated organizational staffing and support within the Canada Revenue Agency.
Let me ask you something, Mr. Betty. What is the first step in beginning to address the problem of anti-Black racism within the public service?
I actually feel that the first step is what you've done tonight. You know, is there has to be the opportunity for us to be able to publicly speak about the problem. There has to be the opportunity for people to be brave enough to raise their voice. And I think once we've recognized, you know, the major challenge that we've had, and in reflecting on, as I said, you know, the last decade or more, we have taken the position that we would like white Canadians to decide what constitutes diversity, what constitutes equality, what constitutes equity. And I think that now is the time for us to begin to define what that means for ourselves, rather than having someone. I've had so many, you know, I had, you know, a call this yesterday that, you know, the Law Society of Upper Canada, you know, now looking at how do they address diversity. And, you know, nothing against the individuals that were on the call, they're all great, but they're not representative of my community. So how can you come up with a policy when you don't really understand the plight of Black lawyers? How can you come up with a policy when you don't understand the plight of Black workers at the CRA? And those voices of those workers are in many ways shackled, because to speak out means that you might be now somehow, I use the term negatively, I don't like using it, blacklisted.
Right.
And so we have to now figure out how we create the pathway to be the decision makers. We have to be the ones that go out and recruit those students that you want to bring into CRA and to say, hey, here are some viable group of individuals that we think would be great employees. We have to train them, we have to mentor them. So, you know, I think the starting point is what we're doing right now, recognizing that our voices can be heard and that we can actually speak truth rather than diplomacy. I mean, a lot of my life has been trying to find that balance between truth and diplomacy. And in many situations, diplomacy, you know, is the card that we have played as a community. It hasn't worked so far. We now have to be very, very strong on the truth side of it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to one of the questions that were posed here by the audience, and that is, does the Employment Equity Act need to be amended to include Blacks as a separate category?
Well, the interesting thing about legislation, especially where you have an administrative body that's governing that legislation, is, you know, you can have policy decisions. You may not even have to change legislatively, but you could have a policy decision because of I mean, you look at the act, it's a great piece of legislation, has all the tools that should be working for us. The fact that it's not working is a systematic issue rather than a problem with the legislation. And so we have to figure out how we aggressively, and in many situations, you know, we forget that we're here because of legal challenges and decisions that many great people such as Thurgood Marshall and any others have stood up and fought. The legal system has been a way of emancipation on many different levels. And here we live in a country where it's very rare, right? You know, that you have these kind of cases being brought forward. And that's a tool that's available for us, and I don't understand why we don't use it more.
So presently, within the public service, and more specifically at the Canada Revenue Agency, the employer has long said that they are adhering to the Employment Equity Act. However, when 4 or 5 racially visible groups are lumped into one, and only 1 or 2 groups are being pulled out consistently from that large pool, the question remains, does Black people need to be a separate category out of that group because the employer has consistently said that they're following the act, but they're not picking Black people as predominantly as they're picking other groups?
Well, I think it's a policy. Amending legislation is such a long, lengthy process. I think what we can do is force the politicians and the corporations to actually look at it from a policy perspective. And if you look at some of the legislation in the state of New York over the last 20 years, they've been able to do that where they said, well, no, we need the Black community to have this amount in these situations. We need the East Asian community to have this amount. So there is a way on a policy level that we can actually address it. And now is the critical time for us to try and do that.
Thank you. Let's extend a little bit on what you just talked about creating programs that would be tailor-made for addressing this situation. What are some of the ways the federal government, CRA, and other departments, what are some of the things that they could do to address anti-Black racism in the workplace? So based on the numbers that I've told you, out of 40,000 employees, we're nowhere close to having as much Black people as the other groups, the other racially visible groups in terms of representation. And I'll talk a little bit about how that trickles over into the labor movement, into the union, because out of 60 locals across the country, I am one of 2 Black presidents. So we have 2 Black presidents out of 60 across the country. And as we go higher up in the union, those numbers drop and drop and drop until there's no representation. As a matter of fact, in the Public Service Alliance, there are no Black people on the National Board of Directors out of, I believe, 20-something executives. So I'm going to talk later on about the union aspect of it. But in the workplace, how can the employer address, what programs can they put in place to effect change so that there's more people employed, more Black people that's employed by the agency, and then there's the ability for them, for their career to progress, for them to be able to have that, for them to come in and actually have a vision that one day I could be a director and actually have a pathway of getting there?
Well, I can refer to 2 examples from my past. I developed the crime prevention program for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and that was a tremendous experience. When I went for the interview after doing everything, the officer in charge told me, you're going to have a challenge because you're Black. How are you going to handle it? But then you look, at a situation where the federal government put aside $100 million for female employees of the RCMP that had faced systematic discrimination. So I think even within CRA, there's the opportunity for the Black employees to create a similar path of asking for compensation for the systematic components. And when you do that, what happens is that you force change, right? So it's interesting that now we have a female commissioner for the RCMP. When I was working with the RCMP, it was unimaginable that that could happen. So, these kind of strategies, they've worked. And I think whether it be in the CRA or in corporate Canada, you've got to figure out a way to hold organizations accountable financially, and then you're going to start seeing the change. It's a strong approach, but it is one that we know from the RCMP settlement, $100 million, without even having to prove that you've been a victim of discrimination. Just the fact that you're within that category, you're going to get a check showing up at your house, is something that I would suggest that the CRA employees, both past and present, take a look at.
Okay, so compensation. So I'm hearing about compensation now, and that's, I think, a very important part. So far I've heard you talk about acknowledgement, right? Starting to acknowledge the issue and talk about it. Now I'm hearing about compensation. I want to ask you about, what about those for career progression? And do you think that it would be illegal or discriminatory for the agency to have a career fair hiring only Black people?
No, absolutely not. Because what's great about the legislation that we have, it actually allows you to do that. I mean, there is legislation which is designed specifically to assist individuals that are marginalized and underprivileged, right? So, you know, if you take McKinsey Consulting, a great company, depends on which side, but they just dedicated $200 million towards consulting with Black groups to kind of raise their opportunities. But McKinsey has a very strong outreach program into the high schools, into the universities. I'm not promoting them, but that's what they do. They actually go out, they make contact with the BBPA, with many other organizations within the community, and they actually organize job fairs where people come in, they do preparation for them before they get to the interview stage. So there are models that are out there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are many different models that are out there that are successful. And I think once we start the dialogue going and rope in the different skill sets that we have, you know, a lot of these models will just automatically kind of float to the top. And we said, you know, why didn't we do this before? Because we, you know, it's something that we should have done long time ago.
Okay. In terms of, so I've heard you mention a couple of things here: acknowledgement, compensation, and targeted hiring towards the Black community, and that would not be in contravention of the Act, as you've mentioned. In terms of, are there any additional steps that the agency can take to ensure that there's sustained permanent change in the issue of recruiting Black people and ensuring that there's a pathway for them for career progression within the agency? Are there any steps?
There has to be data. Like we're a data-driven society, and the numbers usually don't lie. They can be manipulated sometimes, but we've got to reach a situation where we can have the data that's supported. The data is established. These are our goals. And if you don't meet the goals, then you're failed as an organization, right? It really is, you know, that straightforward. And if this is serious to you, then you will set out to accomplish it. And a manager should be measured by, you know, how they've met the diversity goals and inclusion goals that the organization has set for itself, for themselves, right? Not just, you know, kind of, hey, we've got X amount of Black employees that may be at the receptionist role. Not that there's anything wrong with that. We want to be in positions of leadership. We want to know that one day a Black person will be leading the public service union of this country. Those are the things that we want to be able to create a path for that to happen.
You've had some experience dealing with unions, is that correct?
I have on many levels, yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna just go over on the union side a little bit, switch gears a little bit, and what Black people face within the workplace. It's the same thing in the union. So as I was throwing out some numbers earlier on, at a component level, at the Union of Taxation Employees, you know, when I walk in the room and I see people looking around, when I go to attend a conference, and you know, I'm one of probably 3 Black people out of you know, many white counterparts. What can the union do to ensure that there's you know, sufficient Black representation within the union?
Well, nothing is going to be given to us. I think that's the biggest mistake that we've made for the last while, is the expectation that people are somehow going to act in our best interest. It's not going to happen. So it's up to us to push the right buttons to make sure that it happens, whatever that process is within the union organization. We have to be sufficiently organized that pressure can come. If you're not strong enough internally as individuals, that you've got an external group of individuals in different power base that can also be pushing the right buttons to get the changes that need to happen.
Now, I know you're not directly involved in the union, but I'm going to ask you a little bit of a controversial question here, and you can pass if you.
I usually don't pass on the controversial questions. Those are usually the ones I like.
Do you believe, Mr. Betty, that there's anti-Black racism within the labor movement, within the union?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've known other employees in other unions and seen some of the challenges that they've had. They've had to represent some union members against their own organization in my legal career. And I've learned a lot about unions, actually, because I always thought that in many situations, unions really started off as being the progression, the very positive. But as collective bargaining processes have changed, the concept of equity, inclusion, diversity, and even just right across the board equality for all workers, not just Black workers, I think have somehow been diminished.
Okay, so what can the union do to fight for to stand up against anti-Black racism within the workplace and even within their own organization?
I think what needs to happen is that it's the Black members of the union that have to decide what they would like to see from the union based on, their group challenges that you're facing, lack of promotion, lack of outreach, all of those other things, right? So there has to be that collectivity that comes together within your organization and be able to force the mandate from that standpoint.
So are you saying, Mr. Betty, that the few Black people that are involved in the union have to really push the union to do what is right and just?
I think the few Black people have to figure out how you start mobilizing the other Black individuals within the total organization, right? To be able to, not just the members of the union, but the general employees, and develop that base. And where necessary, you can be able to reach out to other organizations that can, hey, come out and support you in achieving that change.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring on our next panelist. Thank you, Mr. Betty, and I appreciate you sharing those comments. I'm just going to take you backstage for a little bit while I bring on the next panelist, and we're going to have some questions coming in, and we'll bring you back as needed. So just stand by. Thank you very much. So that was attorney at law, Courtney Betty, very well known in the corporate legal world. And so we've heard from him that acknowledgement is the first step in addressing anti-Black racism within the workplace. And secondly, he speaks about compensation, that the government, that Black employees, former and present, should be asking the government for compensation for anti-Black racism. He highlights the case in the RCMP, where without even having to present any proof, that the RCMP was able to settle and provide compensation to all women that were hired between a particular time. And having targeted hiring, and that it is not illegal to have targeted hiring for Black people. So we've heard those very important points from Mr. Betty. So thank you very much. I'm going to bring on Dr. Regisford, and he's going to tell us how we can move forward from a healing perspective. So we're going to bring in the doctor to prescribe a solution for us.
Hello.
Fred, good evening. Welcome again.
How are you?
Thank you very much. I know we've had a lot of technical difficulties, so thank you for bearing with us. We do appreciate you staying on and sharing with us. So tell us a little bit about your background and tell us how we can move forward on this issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, as the brochure indicates, my background has been in leadership. I've straddled both world in leadership, human resources. I was a former executive for an organization with HR and organization development. And while doing that, I also continued my private practice, taking on private clients. I want to get to the heart of the matter, and I want to go back a bit so that everyone contextualizes where we are today, where the world is today. On May 25th, we all experienced what can best be described as communal or collective trauma.
Mm.
So we were not alone. We either heard about it, most of us heard about it, and then looked at the video. And there are a few of us that just looked at the video and then saw it for the first time. So because we were in a place where we heard about it, our brains said, nah, can't be. Let me just go on and have a look. We went on and we looked, and we were shocked. We were surprised. In fact, for the 8 minutes and 46 seconds, I'm sure most of us were there, and most of us were thinking to ourselves, no, this can't be happening. This is not real. And part of the reason for that is most, if not all, of the pre-existing incidents or events were by gunshots. This was different. This was in our face for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And we saw and witnessed something that we have never seen, with the exception of going to the theater or watching a movie. And so if we were boorish about watching movies or anything like that, seeing that would be traumatizing.
Right.
It's real. And there's no denial. There's no taking it away from your brain and saying, oh, it's just made up blood and pyrotechnics and all of that stuff. There's none. It's real. So it resonates in our brain in a way that it will remain with us for a long time to come. Young people, children, adults who saw it, we collectively as a community experience trauma. So the healing naturally is about a collective or communal form of healing. Unlike my own trauma, if I got into a car accident, I T-boned someone and I was shocked, went into trauma and went to a counselor, a therapist, this is a bit different. That can happen. But part of the work ahead for all of us, I think, is to recognize that trauma, for all intents and purposes, is a mental injury. In this instance, I'm going to say this is a racial injury. It's an injury to our psyche. I have never seen a lynching in real life. I've seen pictures, very few pictures. But this would be the equivalent of a lynching for me. And what would that do to me as a Black person? Well, it's the same thing that happened with lynching 400 years ago, and even more recently, what we believe. It is intended to break the spirit of the individual. It is intended to send a clear message for 8 minutes and 46 seconds that I no longer have to shoot you. I have the power and the authority of the state to inflict a slow and gradual death on you, the Black person. No one else. And so when we acknowledge that, and we acknowledge that we have collectively, communally experienced this trauma, one of the first steps for us is to be free to speak about it. The data shows clearly that when you experience a traumatic event, you have 30 days within which to start speaking and getting it out of your system, whether it be in a therapist's chair or whether it be you are talking to your friends and family and working that through. The longer you wait, the more cemented it is in your system. And so for those employees, as an example, and I don't want to point them out, but for those employees who spoke earlier on, and I believe Jennifer and Tanya, at a subtext, what they articulated was trauma of being in workspace environments that were deeply toxic, degrading, devaluing, and having to work through that. Both of them, interestingly enough, spoke from a place of resignation, of triumph. Jennifer is in 30 years and and I understand that. And anyone who is marginalized and who's being in that space would understand exactly what she feels like. Enough is enough. I'm done. I'm through. In fact, that's what George Floyd said. But at 8 minutes, he said, Mama, I'm through. Jennifer, I'm through. I'm done. Tanya, when you asked her about a CA position, and I don't know the abbreviations, said, I am through. I am done. No, I just need to get through this and get out. So the event was not just about the death, and yes, it's a horrible event. It was an attempt to break the spirit of a community and of allies and those who support the Black community as well. That's why you see this uprising of people saying, no, we're not going to let this happen. All around the world, in the most unusual of places. So the first thing, let me get back on the script. The first thing is we've got to be free to talk about it and talk about it continuously, get it through our system, because the way in which trauma occurs is that it's not just in our brains and in our minds and our thoughts, it also affects us in our bodies. Stress, high levels of cortisol that remain in our system. It leads to, when it hasn't been processed or dealt with, hypertension, high blood pressure, diabetes, a whole range of other illnesses. Because our brains and the chemical reaction in our brains are not separated from our bodies. And so once we understand the need and the importance of talking about it, it's about who do we talk to about it? Well, you talk to people in your network, and that first concentric circle is your family, your home. And know that it's okay to talk about it in your home, with family members, with your children, and say, this is what I'm feeling. This is what I'm experiencing. In fact, I'm going to be hosting a forum this Saturday called Let Men Speak, which is to have Black men speak and other men who want to join about how they're feeling, how they're experiencing this. And the emotions are wide, from anger, rage, the need for revenge, to abject hopelessness. So talking about it is crucial. The next circle is to be bold and to talk about it in your workplace. Assuming you have friends and colleagues, to talk about it there. And talk about it from a point of this. What can I do? What can we do? And I say to folks, the smallest deed is better than the grandest of intentions. You can do the simple thing. So what have I done? On my email signature, I've simply put, lest we forget.
Right.
I cannot breathe. Mama, I'm through. 8.46 seconds. And it doesn't matter for me who it goes to. And truly, I'm not terribly concerned about who it might offend either. This is what you would call, if any time, at any time ever, a zeitgeist moment, a moment of change for the entire world. So healing, getting back on track, is about the individual being free to talk and getting that negative energy, getting that substance out of them. Being free to talk to family and friends who are trusted, caring, that will provide you the environment that is safe and protected for you to cathartic, to cry, to yell, to scream. And many people have been doing it. Many people have been doing it. The next is with your colleagues, those who you work with, finding the place to do that and not being afraid to talk about it in the workplace. And hopefully that leads to a place of action. Now, there's a whole lot more I can talk to what organizations need to do, because a lot of them have come out and said great and wonderful narratives about their opposition to this heinous idea of anti-Black racism. I would say to employees of all organizations, not just yours, hold your leadership accountable to what they've said. Ask them, what are they going to do? And if it's not going to be sustainable, then it makes no sense to begin the conversation. So I'm going to stop there because I know time is such and it's past the dinner hour for many, but those are some of the things that I would recommend. And of course, for those who are really struggling with it, because it might have triggered other traumatic events in their lives, talk to someone who is a professional.
Thank you very much, Dr. Regisford. We've heard the items that you've outlined there of practical steps that employees can take to addressing it. We've heard that the term that I believe you used was racial trauma, and that's the first time that I've heard that, because over a period of time, if you're discriminated and treated unfairly over a period of time where it's so systematic, you don't consider it really as trauma. You do not consider it as, you just shake it off and you move on. To the average human being, when you hear the word trauma, it would have been like you've been in an accident or you've had some type of life-changing situation. But we've heard from Dr. Regisford that anti-Black racism, it leads to a specific type of trauma that has to be dealt with. So we're hearing that this has the issue of anti-Black racism has a damaging effect on the mental, from a mental perspective, on Black people. Thank you, Dr. Regisford, for sharing your perspective on that. I'm going to just bring back on the Janelle, just to talk a little bit. I'm seeing some questions that are posted here, and perhaps you can answer some of these questions, Janelle. So I'm going to bring you back on.
All right.
One moment. Okay, so what practical steps can be taken to lay a foundation of systemic anti-Black racism within the workplace?
Okay, so that's a big question, and it's an important question at that. I just want to, in my response, I want to kind of illustrate the ways that anti-Black racism kind of manifests in different institutions. And I think it's important that I do that because that will help in terms of some of the steps that can be taken to address it.
Mm-hmm.
So when folks had mentioned going to the high schools, going to the colleges, and doing recruitment, that's a very intentional step, but there's a whole situation, if you would, of anti-Black racism within those institutions that also need to be tackled. So it's not only happening in the workplace, but it's happening in our schools. So it's happening with policing. Black people are 20 times more likely to be shot dead by police in Canada.
Right.
It's happening with hiring, not meeting the requirements of the job. 7 in 10 Black Canadians with the 2016 StatsCan report showed that 7 in 10 Black Canadians have a post-secondary diploma or degree. However, it's not matched with jobs. In fact, Black people have a higher unemployment rate. The unemployment rate for the Black population in 2016 was 9.2% compared to 5.3% for the rest of the population. So that's a serious issue that also needs to be addressed. And then when you think about our schools, there are so many issues that have been well documented and reported on by scholars like Dr. Carl James, Dr. George Day, Dr. Ann Lopez, numerous education scholars have spoken about anti-Black racism in the schools. And I really want to point that out, because if part of the solution is to go to the schools, you might not even find the students in grade 12 yet, right? Mm-hmm. So the students, Black students, are streamed into lower levels. By grade 8, in the Turner Consulting and report done with Tana Turner and Dr. Carl James and numerous others in 2017 towards race equity in education, it noted that a number of Black students are in the applied or the essentials stream. And I really want us to turn our attention to that as well, because that stream in education doesn't lead to university pathways. It leads to college or what's called locally developed stream, workplace. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the students in the locally developed stream don't even make it into the workplace as well, right? So this is a big problem that we kind of need to address as well, because by the time Black kids get to grade 8, they're being told, even if they have A's and B's in school, they're being told, no, academic university stream will be too difficult for you. How about you do this instead? And that's been well documented for decades and decades and decades. So you're not even going to find Black students in those grade 12 classes, because they've already been overwhelmingly pushed out of the education system. So the approach needs to be multi-layered. It needs to be part of every single aspect of our life. And we need to be ever so intentional about how we address anti-Black racism. We can't just say, these are the tangible steps of what I'm going to do within the workplace, and not think about, oh, where my children go to school, are Black students also in this class with them in grade 11 chemistry? Or have all the Black students being pushed out of these classes? So then how would you then raise your voice to demand change within the school as well? Because if we're not addressing it at the education level, we can't even get these kids into these positions where when they're there, they're not being promoted, right? So we need to think of it in terms of all of the systems. So I'm not going to give a neat little checklist, and I'm not going to say these are the steps or the tools. I think it's on people to be critical. And I would say it's not only on the Black people to solve a problem that they did not create. This is a systemic problem going very, very far back. And it's absolutely outrageous that we would think that Black people would need to resolve the problem of anti-Black racism. So what does that mean? It means that non-Black racialized people need to be aware of their privilege. White people need to be aware of their privilege, but not just aware for a week, not just to share hashtag, but to really, really think about, how did I get to this position? How did my colleague not get to this position? Critical and thinking beyond the self. So learn something. Google things that are going on. All of these reports are well documented. Statistics Canada, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, fight for legislation, fight for elected leaders who will kind of push forward these issues and prioritize and name systemic racism as well. Fight within the organization, support Black organizations and group efforts within your workplace, and fight for representation beyond tokenism too. Right. If there's an event, if there's something going on and you know that that social event is where sometimes people might get promoted informally through small talk, say, we're not going to have this event because why? It's Ramadan and certain people won't be able to come to this event, right? Or my Black brothers and sisters won't be able to make it to this event as well. It's not inclusive, right? So thinking about it in creative and generative ways, and thinking about solutions, like being very, very intentional, because if we have a world that is not built on anti-Black racism, not built on anti-Indigenous racism, we can get to that point where the world is just better for everyone, right? Our kids can all flourish together. So I would say in terms of that, really just being reflective and really just being critical about your position within an organization and kind of taking that burden off of people. And sometimes, I'm going to say this, it might be very unfriendly or unpopular, sorry. Sometimes it means not taking the promotion.
Wow.
Sometimes you should step back. I see different job postings that go up, and I would not apply to a job posting that says Indigenous education. I would never, right? Because of my positionality and because of settler colonialism in Canada. And I think twice about these things. But sometimes we need to really, really, really be critical beyond holding the placard, beyond taking the knee. We need to be critical about our position and how our privilege has gotten us to where we are, not our work, right? Because it's been well documented that Black people work very, very hard in this country and have for many years. So it's not a matter of who's working harder, but it's about the opportunities that are afforded to certain people based on this unearned privilege.
Let me go to one of the questions. Other than whites, do other races engage in anti-Black racism?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I spoke to that earlier, and what I said is that we need to think about how a system of anti-Black racism has benefited other races. When I say non-Black racialized communities, I mean other races who are not white, right? So definitely there's anti-Black racism in conversations, like I said, about who parents allow their children to marry. Do they allow their children to marry a Black person? Dr. Vidya Shah, a leading scholar at York University, is having a conversation for South Asian community members this week on this very topic in terms of the insidious nature of anti-Black racism within South Asian communities. Leading scholars in the East Asian community had a conversation right before ours by the Center for Leadership and Diversity at OISE, University of Toronto. And they spoke about how East Asian people have benefited from a system of anti-Black racism, because without anti-Black racism, you wouldn't have the model minority. And the model minority is juxtaposed to the Black person. So most definitely, folks can enact, going back to that big word, power, they can enact power against Black people because, like I said, there's a hierarchy and there's proximity to whiteness. And of course, throughout history, that's changed. But the closer you are to being considered white for whatever socio-political, economic reasons, the closer you are to receiving those or benefiting from those awards. So for sure. And I'd like to also point out that because of Black protests, non-Black racialized communities benefit. So for example, in Canada, it was Black protesters who fought to change the whites only immigration policy. It didn't just happen overnight. And this information is very hard to find. But like I said, it's on all of us to find and to learn this information, to teach our kids, right? To teach our kids about difference beyond just saying, oh, I like your hair, can I touch it? And things like that. But to teach our kids about the true history of anti-Black racism, of slavery, of segregation in this country, and how Black protesters, organizers got out and fought to change these laws, and other communities have benefited because thereafter we have immigration from different parts of the world, right?
Yeah.
So being aware of that. In the States, same thing. Civil rights was enacted, and the same thing happened over there. So being in solidarity and really thinking about solidarity, and it might make, if you're new to this conversation, if, you know, George Floyd's, the killing of George Floyd was what brought you to this consciousness or awareness, think about how that in itself is a privilege as well, right? We need to be very frank about that, and also about the discomfort that could come with privilege. So the discomfort, rather than saying, you know, I feel sorry for you, or I feel bad for the Black people, transforming it, like I like to say, like to empathy, because empathy can actually lead to action, and empathy can actually lead to change. And if it's just sympathy, it's useless, right? You have the same Black people within the organization fighting, and then you have others who are just upholding the system, really. So I would say we need to be really, really critical and really, really intentional about how we can reimagine a future, if you really want to, which is not anti-Black.
Mhm. Thank you very much, Janelle. I'm going to take you back for a little bit. I just want to acknowledge some of our white allies who've joined us here today. Sam Hammond, EFTO president, thank you, brother, for joining us and being a good ally and for showing up. I also want to acknowledge Brother Joel Reisman from the Public Institute, the local president, who's joining us here today. He's been an exceptional ally in advocating against anti-Black racism. And that's what we need, is for our allies to really step forward. Another ally, Alex Silas, the RVP for the National Capital Region for the Public Service Alliance of Canada. He's been a great ally to the Black community. And being an ally doesn't mean, you know, putting forward solutions, but sometimes it just means listening and learning, you know, about our experiences, about our lived experiences, and educating yourself about the issue and how and what are the practical steps that can be taken. Many people have come up to me and says, Nicholas, what do I do? How do I can't tell you what to do. As an ally, you have to do your research. You have to understand how we got there, how we got to this system, and what are the practical steps that we can take to resolve it. So I think it's you know, it's a very important point. So our allies, I want to thank you so much. I'm going to bring back on everyone. If there's any final words that you'd like to share, you can go for it right now.
Just in closing, from my perspective, I want to talk about allyship. It's something that I was inspired to write about last week, and I've shared it with others and received some feedback on it. And I think it's important. We have corporate organizations making bold statements for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And we have individuals who speak about being an ally. But we really need to be clear about what an ally is. And I think the first piece of work for me, for an ally, is to acknowledge the events, the historical events, as well as the current day events. And I'm going to abbreviate my words here. And I ask the ally to ask themselves a question. Why? Why do I consider myself to be an ally? And then once that work, that deep personal internal work has occurred, what is the work for me to do? Because you see, an ally has to be prepared to acknowledge their privilege that comes through their whiteness in this society vis-a-vis me. But more importantly, that they have been prepared to risk that privilege, lose that privilege. So when an ally says, I'm taking a stance amongst my colleagues. No, let me start with the first circle, as I mentioned, my family. And when I hear these comments or these remarks about Black people and Black bodies, I'm going to raise my hand and say, absolutely not. This is wrong. This is incorrect. When they're prepared to say, yes, I don't have a problem with my daughter or my son marrying someone who's Black. Or when they go to a store and they notice that the sales agent attends to them first, even though the Black person was in line first, that they're prepared to say, no, that is inappropriate. He or she was here first. When they have demonstrated a loss of their privilege to me, then they're welcome at the table of allyship.
Wow.
Because their privilege has cost them, because certainly for me and others, there has been a cost for white supremacy and the presence and the prevailing presence of white supremacy in our society, whether it be in the form of jobs, educational opportunities, the way I'm treated by the systems and its agencies. There has been a loss to me. So what loss have you considered losing? What loss have you experienced that says, yeah, I am now at the table and deserving to be at the table of allyship? So those would be the last comments that I will posit for the audience.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Regisford. Mr. Betty, any?
I want to thank you, Nicholas, for bringing this together. And I think what's critical is, from my standpoint, I know there are other individuals that are there, but I also think that the panelists that you brought together, we share so much in common, and it would be fantastic for us to create some form of a unity and become part of the solution. With the challenges faced with the Public Service Union, and specifically with Canada Revenue Agency, how we, not just being part of this dialogue this evening, but also can we become a part of the solution moving forward. So that'd be, the one point that I want to leave us with, that, it's great for us to have our voices heard today, but we have to have a system of being able to create accountability on all levels, and whether it be looking at it from the psychological standpoint or from the education standpoint or the legal component, they all need to come together as part of the solution. Because the minute they're able to isolate and say, hey, we're going to focus on the education, then you forget about the psychological impact, and then create a mentality where people forget their legal rights. So right. I think it's great bringing these panelists together, and I look forward to continuing our dialogue, if nothing else, among the panelists, and work along with you to see how we can be part of the solution that you're trying to achieve.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brady. Ms. Brady.
Yes, so thank you, Nicholas, for having me here today. And thank you to the panelists and to the folks who shared at the beginning, who are going through this day in, day out. I appreciate you and what you do, so thank you. I just want to say, for those who are not Black, that just imagine, right? Based on what your colleagues have said so far, imagine getting up, getting ready, going to work, and then having this big weight on your shoulder too, right? And this big weight that tons of people have to carry every single day is anti-Black racism, right? So you're having to deal with bills, your house, your kids, not listening, all of these things, maybe sexism, maybe ableism, but then you also have this giant weight called anti-Black racism. And just basically out of humanity and caring for others within our community, I think it's high time that we take that weight off the shoulders of our colleagues, of our friends, of our community, and really, really, really demand change. And there are so many ways that we can do that. And I'm not encouraging folks to just go and start sending tons of inbox messages to Nicholas after this without any real critical thought but any real action. I really hope that this can be a moment for change, and also in how we approach working with the clients too, because if we don't have representation of the workers, how do the workers then deal with Black people, Black clients, or Black, I don't know the word, sorry, Nicholas, for the industry, but people that you're talking to on the phone, you have no idea about their culture there. Which?
Taxpayers.
Taxpayers, good. Taxpayers, how do we deal with taxpayers who are non-white, right? How do we approach them? How do we address them? How do we understand their issues, their histories, their lived experiences? Like the panelist said, if Black people are not the decision makers, these conversations will be kind of fraught, right? So I really want us to think about empathy, and empathy, how it can be transformed into action so that we can remove that burden of anti-Black racism, not only within the CRA, within the public service sector, but in all sectors, really being intentional about that. So thank you so much, Nicholas, for doing this. And thank you folks for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you so much, Ms. Brady. So we've had a very holistic conversation, and this is just a start of where we are going with this. And as Dr. Regisford said, that speaking about this is vitally important for us moving forward. So we're going to continue to speak about it, and we are going to apply a lot of the steps that Mr. Betty outlined here, giving his experience as a senior attorney with experience in diversity and inclusion and writing policies for governments and other organizations. And he's mentioned a very important point in the first part, is acknowledging that this exists within the agency and then creating a plan to address that situation. And that plan could include compensation and targeted hiring and other steps to permanently address the situation. Because once money is involved, then then there tends to be the government tends to ensure that they're getting value for money, and that it is sustained, and that they don't have to pay out monies again. We've also heard from Dr. Regisford that not only talking about this, but that over a period of time, this creates trauma. Racial trauma is the term that Dr. Regisford used. And we've learned from Ms. Brady how to identify our privilege and how to speak to it and how to be a good ally. So those are all things that we could put together and that would help us to move forward in the next phase of this fight. I just want to acknowledge our regional executive vice president for the Public Service Alliance of Canada, Ontario, Sharon D'Souza, who's joining us, who's been a tremendous support and ally in the fight against anti-Black racism. So thank you, Sister D'Souza, for joining us here today. And I just want to thank all the members who joined and from all the different agencies. And we really appreciate your support. Putting on this event, it almost didn't happen, and with very little support. And, I just want to thank you for being there. And for those of you who are on the employer side, at that senior level looking on, you've heard about the employees' experiences. You've heard from the experts. It is time to act. On the union side, you've heard, about, how Black people are not represented. We have a diversity committee, and there's no Black people. What is that? So we have a lot of work to do on the union side as well, and in all aspects. And to the decision makers and those listening on the other side, let's work together. We are not here to embarrass anyone. We're here to ensure that these discussions are had, and any solution on anti-Black racism must include Black people at the table, having those discussions and being part of the decision-making process. So I want to thank everyone for attending this town hall. It's the first of many, and we're going to keep pushing. I've written to the commissioner of CRA on acknowledging that this exists within the agency. I've asked the commissioner to take that step. We've also asked to be included in any. I know the agency doesn't have a lot of Black people, but there are a few of us, and we want to be part of that important discussion on how to make us whole again. And again, thank you. We're committed to this cause, and thank you so much to all the allies and for speaking up, and for being there, all the local presidents, Andrew Collin, Selby Hewitt, all of the local people, Sherry Whalen, thank you so much for supporting and standing side by side with us and fighting for a more just and equitable workplace and union. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good night.